A powerful motorcade rolls through the city, then suddenly it stops. Donald Trump steps out, his eyes locked on a frail homeless girl holding a desperate sign. What happens next will not only change her life forever, but will leave the entire world in shock. Why did he stop? And what did he do next? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The afternoon sun hung mercilessly in the sky, casting a golden haze over the city streets. Heat radiated from the asphalt, blurring the edges of honking cars and hurried pedestrians. Amidst the urban chaos, a motorcade sliced through traffic like a steel serpent, its sleek black vehicles moving with calculated precision. Cadillac One, the most secure vehicle in the world, led the procession, carrying none other than Donald J. Trump himself. Inside, the former president sat with an air of authority, attentively listening to a report from his senior advisor. The conversation was heavy, focused on economic strategies and national security threats. But just as he was about to respond, something outside the window caught his eye. At first it was barely noticeable, a small figure amidst the blur of movement, but something about it made him pause, his gaze sharpened. There, standing on the sidewalk, barely visible between the masses, was a little girl. Her clothes hung loosely from her thin frame, her hair tangled and streaked with dirt. Clutched in her trembling hands was a piece of battered cardboard, the words scrawled across it in uneven letters. "Please help, my family needs a miracle." Trump's brow furrowed. He exhaled sharply, his fingers instinctively tapping against the leather seat. He had seen desperation before, had been face to face with poverty, hardship, and struggle, but there was something different about this, something that unsettled him. The girl stood motionless, her wide blue eyes scanning each passing car, searching, pleading. Most people rushed past her, eyes down, shoulders hunched, pretending not to see. A flicker of emotion crossed his face. Then his voice cut through the steady hum of conversation inside the car. "Stop the car." The motorcade jolted to a halt. Tires screeched against the pavement, the sudden interruption sending a ripple of confusion through the convoy. The Secret Service agents in the front seat exchanged alarmed glances. The lead security officer turned in his seat, his earpiece crackling. "Sir, I strongly advise against stopping here. This is an unsecured area." Trump didn't even glance at him. His eyes remained locked on the child standing outside. His jaw tightened. "I said, stop the car." There was a moment of hesitation before the driver obeyed, pulling the Cadillac One smoothly to the curb. Behind them, the entire convoy came to a stop, their sudden stillness in stark contrast to the restless motion of the city. The murmurs began almost instantly. Pedestrians slowed, pulling out their phones, whispering among themselves. What was happening? Why had Trump's motorcade come to an unscheduled halt in the middle of a crowded street? The growing spectacle was met with murmurs of speculation, but inside the vehicle, there was only a charged silence. The head of security leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Mr. Trump, we have a schedule to keep. This is not a safe area. We can send someone later to..." Trump finally turned to him, his eyes cold and unwavering. "If that little girl can stand on a street corner in this heat, holding a sign asking for help, then I can step out of this car and find out why." The officer fell silent. He knew that tone. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Before anyone could argue further, Trump reached for the door handle and pushed it open. The moment his polished shoes hit the pavement, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavier, conversations hushed, eyes widened. Even the honking of impatient drivers seemed to fade into the background. The 45th President of the United States, a man who had once occupied the highest seat of power, was now walking through the crowded sidewalk toward a homeless child. Lily, unaware of the growing crowd, gripped her sign tighter, her small fingers curling around its torn edges. She flinched slightly as the towering figure approached her. She had never seen him in person, only on television screens in store windows, but there was something about the way he moved, his presence commanding yet not unkind, that made her hesitate. Trump knelt before her, bringing himself to her level. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked at her, studying her small, fragile frame, the way her lip trembled as she tried to remain strong. Finally, in a voice far softer than the one that had commanded boardrooms and world leaders, he asked, "What's your name, sweetheart?" The little girl swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lily." Trump gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Where are you standing out here, Lily?" She hesitated, her big blue eyes flickering between him and the suited men standing nearby. She didn't trust adults, not anymore. Most of them looked away when they passed. But there was something about this man, something that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, he was actually listening. She took a deep breath. "My mom, she's sick. We don't have a home anymore. My dad, he was a soldier." Her voice cracked slightly. "Who died in the war." A heavy silence settled over them. Trump's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes flickered. Something almost imperceptible. He inhaled deeply, then turned toward the lead security agent standing stiffly behind him. "Get the car ready." The agent stiffened. "Sir." Trump rose to his full height, his gaze unwavering. "I want to see where she lives." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, phones recorded feverishly. The Secret Service tensed, their earpieces buzzing with hurried instructions. This was not in the day's schedule. But Trump had already made up his mind. He turned back to Lily and extended a hand. "Lead the way." And just like that, the most powerful man in the world followed a little girl into the unknown. The convoy moved cautiously through the city streets, a stark contrast to the towering skyline and luxurious storefronts they had passed minutes ago. As the Cadillac One rolled deeper into the lower-income neighborhoods, the shift in atmosphere was undeniable. Gleaming glass buildings faded into crumbling structures, their walls stained with time and hardship. Sidewalks narrowed, littered with forgotten scraps and shattered bottles. The air felt heavier here, thick with the scent of desperation, of stories left untold. Inside the car, Donald Trump sat in contemplative silence, his gaze fixed outside the tinted window. He wasn't just observing the scenery, he was studying it. He had been in countless cities across America, had seen poverty firsthand, but it never got easier to stomach. It was one thing to hear statistics in meetings, another to see the hollowed faces of people who had been forgotten by the system. Beside him, Lily sat stiffly, her small hands clenching the hem of her faded hoodie. She had never ridden in a car like this before, let alone sat beside a man whose face had once been on television screens in every store window. Her tiny frame barely made a dent in the leather seat, and despite the air conditioning, she still shivered slightly. Trump noticed. Without a word, he reached into the compartment near his seat and pulled out a small, neatly folded blanket. It wasn't much, just something kept in the vehicle for emergencies, but he draped it gently over her shoulders. She hesitated for a moment, then looked up at him. "Thank you," she murmured. "You're welcome, kiddo," Trump replied, his voice gruff but kind. The convoy slowed as the streets became more narrow. Secret Service agents in the lead vehicle exchanged tense glances. This was not a neighborhood designed to welcome motorcades, especially ones carrying a former president. Their radios crackled with updates from security teams stationed further ahead. Unfamiliar activity detected at the next intersection. Several unidentified individuals lingering near entry points. Proceeding with caution. Trump heard every word, but his expression remained unreadable. Lily fidgeted beside him, biting her lip before finally speaking. "It's just a little further, Mr. Trump." He nodded. "Take your time." As the car turned down an alley, the full reality of Lily's world came into view. The gleaming city was now a distant memory. Here, the buildings sagged under the weight of neglect, their wooden frames barely holding together. Makeshift homes lined the alley, scraps of metal, tarps, and broken bricks fashioned into shelters. The air smelled damp, a mixture of mildew, rust, and the lingering scent of smoke from a trash fire burning in the distance. The Cadillac came to a slow stop. Outside, Worn faces peeked from doorways, their tired eyes fixating on the unfamiliar sight of a polished black limousine in the middle of their forgotten world. Mothers clutched their children's hands. Men, their shoulders weighed down with years of struggle, leaned against crumbling walls, their expressions unreadable. Some watched in silence, others whispered amongst themselves. As Trump stepped out of the car, the murmurs grew louder. This wasn't a place politicians visited. People like him weren't supposed to be here. One of the Secret Service agents stepped forward. "Sir, I strongly advise against this." Trump turned, his expression firm. "You don't have to follow me, but I'm not leaving." The agent fell silent. They knew better than to argue. Lily hesitated before stepping onto the cracked pavement. She led him toward the end of the alley where a makeshift shelter stood, a fragile assembly of wooden planks and torn tarps. The entrance was covered by a threadbare curtain, and next to it sat a small, rusted metal bowl filled with coins and crumpled dollar bills. A sign was propped against the wall. "Any help is a blessing, God bless you." Lily stopped at the entrance. She turned to Trump, her eyes filled with something that looked like both hope and shame. This is home." Trump didn't say anything at first. He simply looked. The sight of it hit him harder than he expected. This wasn't just poverty. This was survival. Inside, a faint coughing could be heard, the kind that rattled deep in the lungs. Lily's expression grew worried. Without another word, she pulled back the curtain. A frail woman lay inside, her body thin, her skin pale, her breath shallow. She was wrapped in a thin blanket, her head resting against a makeshift pillow of bundled clothes. Her tired eyes fluttered open. When they focused on the man standing at her doorway, her lips parted slightly in shock. "Mr. Trump?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Disbelief flashed across her sunken features. For a moment it seemed as if she thought she was dreaming. Trump knelt beside her, his presence suddenly not that of a world leader but of a man, one witnessing suffering he could not ignore. "You don't need to say anything," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "Just tell me what you need." Lily's mother's lips trembled, her hands clutching the blanket tighter as if trying to steady herself. "I just need my little girl to have a chance." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Trump inhaled deeply, then turned to his security team. "I want medical personnel here, now." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the force of an unbreakable command. The Secret Service agents exchanged hesitant glances, but within seconds, one was already speaking into his earpiece. Lily's mother blinked in shock. You don't have to." Trump reached out and placed a firm but gentle hand on her frail shoulder. "Your husband served this country. Now it's time this country serves you." Tears welled in her eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. Outside, the whispers had turned into a hush of anticipation. Something was happening, something they had never seen before. And as the night fell over the crumbling streets, hope, genuine, undeniable hope, began to stir. The silence in the makeshift shelter stretched between them like a thin thread, heavy with unspoken struggles and the weight of desperation. Donald Trump knelt beside the frail woman, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something unmistakable: resolve. This was not the kind of suffering he could walk away from. This was not a story he would forget. Lily clutched her mother's trembling hand, her tiny fingers wrapped protectively around the woman who had given her everything, despite having so little left to give. Her mother's breathing was labored, shallow and unsteady. Every rise and fall of her chest looked like a battle against something unseen, against time, against fate, against the circumstances that had left her lying here in the dim light of a tattered home. Trump exhaled sharply, turning to his security detail. "Where are the medics?" One of the agents, still holding his earpiece, glanced at him uneasily. "Sir, we have a team on standby, but they're waiting for clearance. This area is difficult." Trump's expression hardened. "Then clear it." His voice left no room for argument. I don't care what you have to do, get them here now." The agent hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding sharply and relaying the command. The woman tried to sit up, her weak body trembling with the effort. "Please, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "I don't want special treatment. There are so many others here who need help too. I'm not the only one." Trump studied her, his jaw tightening. This was what people didn't see, what the cameras never captured. The forgotten families, the ones who didn't ask for pity, only for the chance to survive. He leaned in slightly, his tone softer now. "What's your name?" "Grace," she whispered. "Grace," Trump repeated, nodding slowly. "Listen to me. Your husband gave his life for this country. That means this country owes you, not just words, not just empty promises, but real help." A tear slipped down Grace's cheek. She had heard promises before. So many people had passed through this neighborhood, offering sympathy, but never solutions. But there was something different in the way Trump spoke. It wasn't just words, it was action waiting to happen. She hesitated before speaking again. "I just want Lily to be okay." At that, Trump turned to Lily, who was trying so hard to be brave. He saw it in her wide blue eyes. The way she held back her fear, the way she clung to the belief that somehow, just maybe, tonight would be different. He reached out and rested a reassuring hand on her small shoulder. "Lily, I want you to listen to me carefully." His voice was firm but kind. "You are not alone. You don't have to fight this battle by yourself anymore." Lily blinked up at him, her lips parting slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Trump straightened up and turned to his security team again. "Get my phone, now." Another agent handed him a secure line, and Trump dialed a number without hesitation. The room was deathly silent as they listened. "It's me," he said the moment the call connected. "I need a hospital bed secured immediately. Not tomorrow, not in an hour, right now." Whoever was on the other end responded quickly, and Trump's gaze flickered toward Grace. He listened, nodded once, and then spoke again. "I don't care what strings need to be pulled, pull them. And another thing, this neighborhood? I want a full evaluation of every family here. If they need medical care, housing, education, support, I want a team handling it before sunrise." The agents around him exchanged glances. This wasn't just about one family anymore. Trump was making it clear change was coming, whether the system was ready for it or not. Grace covered her mouth with a trembling hand. I don't know what to say." Trump knelt again, meeting her weary eyes. "You don't have to say anything. Just focus on getting better." At that moment, a commotion stirred outside, the sound of footsteps, voices rising, a ripple of energy moving through the narrow alley. One of the agents at the door turned, speaking into his earpiece. "Sir, the medical team has arrived." Lily's breath hitched. "They really came?" Trump smiled, just slightly. "They came for you." The next few minutes unfolded like something out of a dream. Paramedics moved quickly into the small shelter, their hands careful yet efficient as they assessed Grace's condition. They wrapped her in blankets, checked her vitals, and gently lifted her onto a stretcher. As they prepared to load her into the waiting ambulance, Grace reached out weakly. Trump took her hand. "You're going to be okay, Grace." His voice held absolute certainty. Tears welled in her eyes again. "Thank you." Trump shook his head. "No. Thank you for raising a daughter strong enough to fight for you." Lily squeezed her mother's hand as long as she could before the medics carefully guided her away. The last thing Grace saw before being lifted into the ambulance was Trump standing there, watching, making sure every single step was taken to help her. As the ambulance pulled away, Lily turned to Trump. For the first time since he met her, she smiled. "I think you're our miracle." Trump chuckled, shaking his head. "No, kid, you were your own miracle. You just needed someone to see it." But as he looked around, at the people now gathered, some crying, some whispering, some watching with cautious hope, he knew this was bigger than just one girl, bigger than one family. This was the start of something much, much greater. The air outside the tiny shelter felt different now. The ambulance carrying Grace had disappeared into the night, its flashing lights reflecting off the cracked pavement. But as it drove away, the once wary crowd that had gathered in the alley did not disperse. Instead, they lingered, watching, whispering, waiting. Donald Trump stood at the center of it all, his sharp gaze moving from face to face, taking in the exhaustion, the quiet desperation. These were not just onlookers. These were people abandoned by a system that had promised them more. A murmur ran through the crowd as an older man with sunken eyes and calloused hands hesitantly stepped forward. His clothes were worn, his shoulders hunched, as if years of disappointment had pressed them down. "Mr. Trump," the man began, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Is it true? Is someone really helping her? Helping Grace?" Trump turned to him, his expression unwavering. "She's in the best hands now, and it won't stop with her." At that, a young mother holding a toddler with a dirt-smudged face stepped forward, her eyes brimming with uncertainty. "And what about the rest of us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens when the cameras leave?" Trump exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He knew the doubt in their voices. He'd seen it before. People who had heard promises from politicians, from organizations, from anyone who needed their struggles to look good in a press release. And then, when the headlines faded, so did the help. But this was different. He turned, locking eyes with his security chief. "Get my team on the phone. I need an assessment of this entire neighborhood, families, resources, what's missing, what's broken. Tonight." His advisors exchanged uneasy glances. "Sir, this area is forgotten," Trump interrupted, his voice cutting through the night. "And that changes now." The tension in the crowd shifted. Hope, suspicion, a fragile balance between the two. No one spoke, but their eyes remained locked on him, waiting for what came next. And then, Lily stepped forward. She had been silent since the ambulance left, but now she clutched her cardboard sign against her chest, her blue eyes wide with something raw, something unshakable. "Can you really fix this?" she asked. "Not just my mom, everyone?" Trump looked down at her, at this tiny warrior who had forced the world to pay attention. He crouched to her level, his voice steady, unwavering. "Lily, I don't just want to fix it. I want to make sure no kid ever has to hold a sign like that again." A hush fell over the alley. The people who had spent years living in the shadows of society were now staring at a man who wasn't afraid to look back at them. From the edge of the gathering, a teenage boy with a thin frame and wary eyes spoke up. "No one comes here," he said, his voice sharp with bitterness. "Politicians talk about us when they need votes, then they disappear." Trump stood, his gaze steady. "Then I guess I'm not a politician, am I?" The boy frowned. "So, what happens now?" Trump turned to his security team. "Secure this location. I want my people back here by morning." An advisor stepped closer, his face tense. "Sir, this is going to require resources, logistics." "Then get them," Trump said without hesitation. "Find out how many veteran families are here, how many kids are out of school, how many people are going to sleep hungry tonight." The advisor hesitated. "And after that?" Trump's jaw tightened. "Then we make damn sure it never happens again." A quiet ripple went through the crowd. For the first time, their skepticism was beginning to crack. An old woman, her hands trembling, wiped away a tear and whispered, Maybe this time is different." Trump turned back to Lily, his expression softer now. "Go home, kid. Get some sleep. Big things are about to happen." Lily nodded slowly, clutching her sign like a relic of the past, a past that, for the first time, she might finally be able to leave behind. As Trump stepped away, the streetlight cast long shadows on the crumbling pavement. He knew this wasn't just a promise. It was a war, and he had every intention of winning it. The sun had barely risen when the first convoy of vehicles rolled into the forgotten neighborhood. The streets, once empty except for those who had nowhere else to go, were now lined with government officials, aid workers, and security personnel. The rhythmic hum of engines and the clatter of hurried footsteps echoed through the alleys, signaling that something monumental was happening. Donald Trump arrived in Cadillac One just as he had the night before, but this time he wasn't alone. A team of specialists, medical professionals, urban planners, and veteran aid coordinators stepped out with him. Word had spread fast. What had started as a single act of kindness toward a desperate little girl was now an operation that could change the lives of an entire community. But before the real work could begin, Trump had unfinished business. He stepped out of his car and spotted Lily standing near her home, clutching the same cardboard sign from the night before. Her blue eyes, once filled with desperation, now held something new. Hope. "Good morning, Lily," Trump said as he approached. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded hesitantly. "I think so." She looked past him at the line of trucks and the workers unloading supplies. "Are they really here to help?" Trump knelt down in front of her, his voice steady. "They're here because of you, kid." Lily's lip quivered. She had spent so long fighting for someone to listen, and now it was happening. Behind them, the slum's residents emerged from their homes, cautious, watching. Some still didn't believe this was real. They had heard promises before, seen cameras show up, only to disappear when the headlines grew stale. Trump turned to them, his voice carrying across the alley. "You've been ignored for too long, forgotten. That ends today." A murmur rippled through the crowd. For the first time in years, they were being seen. Just then, a black SUV pulled up, and Dr. Harris, a renowned physician specializing in treating underprivileged communities, stepped out. He adjusted his glasses and approached Trump with purpose. "Sir, we've set up a medical station 2 blocks down. We're prioritizing immediate health concerns, malnutrition, chronic illnesses, anything critical." Trump nodded and turned to Lily. "Let's check on your mom." The girl didn't hesitate. She grabbed his hand and led him inside her home. Grace lay in the same spot as before, but this time she wasn't alone. 2 paramedics hovered over her, checking her vitals. Her eyes flickered open at the sound of footsteps, and when she saw Trump again, a weak smile crossed her lips. "You came back," she whispered. Trump knelt beside her. "I told you I would." A tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, "Thank you." The moment was interrupted by one of the paramedics. "Her condition is treatable, but she needs sustained care. We can move her to the facility now." Lily's grip on her mother's hand tightened. "You're taking her away?" Trump placed a reassuring hand on the little girl's shoulder. "Not away. Somewhere she can get better." The tension in Lily's small frame eased. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was losing something. She was gaining hope. As the paramedics carefully lifted Grace onto the stretcher, Trump turned back to Lily. "Come on, let's make sure the rest of the neighborhood gets help too." The next few hours were a blur of movement. Doctors examined patients, aid workers handed out food and water, a group of urban planners took notes on the crumbling infrastructure. One by one, residents stepped forward, sharing their struggles. A veteran named Marcus, who had lost his leg in combat, spoke about how he had been denied benefits. A single mother, Maria, held her malnourished toddler and whispered about how she had been turned away from shelters too many times. Each story fueled Trump's resolve. This wasn't just one neighborhood, it was a crisis that stretched across the country. He turned to his team, his voice firm. "We don't just patch things up here and leave. We build something better, permanent. This is just the beginning." The sun rose higher, casting golden light over the scene. What had been a place of despair only hours before was now filled with action, with purpose. And standing in the middle of it all, holding her tattered cardboard sign, Lily watched as the world changed around her. The sun climbed higher into the sky, casting long shadows over the once forgotten neighborhood that now buzzed with movement. The air, once thick with hopelessness, was now charged with something different: change. As teams of workers set up mobile clinics, relief stations, and emergency housing units, the people who had spent years believing they were invisible began to feel seen. Donald Trump stood in the middle of it all, watching closely. His suit jacket had been discarded hours ago, his sleeves rolled up as he moved between groups of volunteers and officials. He wasn't here for a photo op. He was here to make sure every single person in this community got the help they had been denied for too long. Nearby, Lily was glued to his side, her wide blue eyes flicking between the unfolding scene and the man who had made it all happen. For so long she had lived in a world where adults walked past her without a second glance, where her pleas for help had been drowned out by the noise of a city that didn't care. But today was different. Today she was standing beside someone who had listened. "Mr. Trump," a voice interrupted. Trump turned to see Dr. Harris, the physician leading the medical relief effort. His brow was furrowed, a clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. "We've assessed most of the residents, and the results are worse than we feared," Dr. Harris said grimly. "Chronic malnutrition, untreated illnesses, children with infections that should have been caught months ago. The situation isn't just dire, it's criminal." Trump's jaw tightened. He had seen poverty before. He had visited struggling communities and spoken to families who had been left behind. But this was something else. Lily tugged on his sleeve. "What does that mean?" she asked hesitantly. Trump exhaled, kneeling to meet her gaze. "It means no one should have to live like this, Lily, and I won't let it continue." As he rose, his determination sharpened into something even stronger: outrage. He turned to his security team. "I want direct contact with my advisors in Washington. We're not just fixing this neighborhood, we're changing policy. Effective immediately, I want a full-scale review of how veteran families and communities like this are being treated." One of his aides hesitated. "Sir, that's going to be a major battle. There are a lot of—" Trump cut him off with a sharp look. "I don't care how difficult it is. These people fought for their country. They shouldn't have to fight just to survive." Behind him, the crowd of residents had gathered. They had been watching him closely, waiting to see if this was just another politician making empty promises. But as they listened, something changed. The murmurs of skepticism turned into something more: hope. An elderly man stepped forward, his frail hands gripping a worn veteran's cap. His voice trembled as he spoke. "My son died in the war, Mr. Trump. He fought for this country, and when he was gone, they forgot about me." He glanced at the relief workers around him, tears welling in his eyes. "But you came back. You really came back." Trump's expression softened as he placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder. "Not just for today," he assured him. "This is only the beginning." The crowd murmured in agreement, their skepticism melting away. Nearby, Lily watched everything unfold, her small hand still clutching her now crumpled cardboard sign. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't begging strangers for help. She was standing in the middle of a movement that had started because of her. One of the relief workers, a woman with kind eyes, knelt beside Lily. "We're going to take care of your mom, sweetheart," she said gently. "She's getting the treatment she needs." Lily blinked up at her, her lip quivering. "Really?" The woman nodded. "Really?" A choked sob escaped Lily's throat before she lunged forward, wrapping her arms around Trump's waist. "Thank you," she whispered, her small frame trembling. Trump hesitated for a brief moment before returning the hug, his large hands resting protectively on the child's back. He had built skyscrapers. He had sat in the most powerful office in the world. But at that moment, standing in the middle of a crumbling neighborhood with a little girl clinging to him, he felt the weight of something even greater: responsibility. When Lily finally pulled away, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her tattered hoodie, Trump smiled. "You started all of this, you know." Lily sniffled. "I just wanted my mom to get better. And because of you," Trump said, "so will hundreds of other families." The weight of those words hung in the air, and Lily stood a little taller. As the day stretched on, the operation continued at full force. Medical teams worked tirelessly, relief workers distributed food and supplies, and security personnel ensured that no one was left out. At one point, a young mother approached Trump, her hands shaking as she held on to her toddler. "You gave us something we haven't had in a long time," she whispered. Trump tilted his head. "What's that?" She swallowed hard. "A future." Those words stayed with him as he turned back to his team. This wasn't a charity visit. This was a mission, and it was only just beginning. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the once forgotten slum had been transformed into a scene of action and purpose. Relief workers moved efficiently, doctors treated the sick, and families, many of whom had spent years living in the shadows, finally felt like they mattered. But for Donald Trump, this was only the beginning. Trump stood at the center of it all, his presence commanding yet approachable. He wasn't just overseeing the efforts, he was in the trenches, speaking to the people, shaking hands, listening. These were the Americans that had been overlooked, pushed aside by a system that had promised them support but delivered only neglect. "Lily," he said, turning to the little girl who had unknowingly sparked this movement, "this isn't just about you and your mother anymore. This is about making sure no one in this country is left behind again." She nodded, eyes filled with a newfound strength. She wasn't just a helpless child anymore. She was a symbol, a reminder that change begins when even the smallest voices are heard. Suddenly, a group of local reporters arrived, cameras and microphones in hand. They had caught wind of what was happening and wanted to see for themselves. They hadn't expected to find Trump standing in the middle of a crumbling alley, surrounded by struggling families. A female reporter, her expression both curious and skeptical, stepped forward. "Mr. Trump, the world is watching. People want to know, why are you here? Why did you stop your motorcade for a single child when there are thousands in need across the country?" Trump turned to her, his face unreadable for a moment. Then, with a steady voice, he replied, "Because if you save one life, you change the world." The reporter hesitated, caught off guard. She had expected political rhetoric. Instead, she got conviction. "But surely," she pressed, "you can't fix poverty overnight." Trump exhaled sharply, his gaze sweeping over the crowd of weary yet hopeful faces. "No, I can't. But I can start. And so can every single person watching this right now. The question isn't whether we can fix it overnight. The question is, are we willing to try?" A murmur spread through the reporters. This wasn't a campaign speech. This was real. At that moment, a security agent approached Trump, speaking in hushed tones. There was a situation. An angry local official was on his way, furious that the president had shown up without warning, exposing the failures of the local government. Trump smirked slightly. Of course, there was pushback. There always was when the truth came out. Minutes later, a tall, sharp-suited man with an air of arrogance stormed into the slum, flanked by his own security, the mayor of the city. He looked around, his face tight with controlled anger, as he took in the makeshift clinics and crowds gathered around Trump. This was a PR nightmare for him. "Mr. Trump," the mayor said, forcing a smile, "while I appreciate your concerns, I must say that this," he gestured to the bustling relief effort, "is highly irregular. You should have coordinated with local authorities before taking action." Trump folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "And how long would that have taken?" The mayor blinked. "Excuse me? How long would it have taken for you to approve assistance for these people?" Trump asked, his voice calm but cutting. "Days? Weeks? Months? Because that's how long they've been waiting, and they can't wait any longer." The crowd stirred, some nodding in agreement. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. "I assure you we have programs in place," the mayor began, but Trump cut him off. "Programs?" Trump repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Where were these programs when Lily was standing on the street, begging for help? Where were they when her mother was dying in a makeshift shack?" Silence. The mayor opened his mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing he could say. The truth was standing all around him. One of the reporters, emboldened by Trump's words, turned to the mayor. "Sir, if there are existing programs, why is this the first time we're hearing about them?" The mayor's face paled. Another journalist chimed in. "Do you deny that this area has been neglected for years?" The mayor stiffened. But before he could answer, one of the local residents stepped forward, an elderly woman, her face lined with the hardships of decades. "We don't need more speeches," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "We need leaders who actually do something." The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement. Trump turned back to the mayor, his expression firm. "So here's what's going to happen. You can either work with us to fix this, or you can get out of the way." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, the mayor nodded. He had no choice. The relief efforts continued, now with the reluctant but necessary cooperation of the local government. Trump's message had been made clear, not just to this city, but to the entire nation. As the night wore on, the slum that had once been forgotten was alive with something new: hope. Families who had spent years struggling in silence finally felt like they mattered. And at the center of it all was one small girl, holding on to a man who had stopped everything to listen to her. Lily looked up at Trump, her voice barely a whisper. "Did we really change things?" Trump crouched down beside her, meeting her gaze. "Lily, this isn't just change. This is a movement." The slum, once forgotten and ignored, was now a center of change. What had started as a simple act of stopping a motorcade had ignited something far greater: an awakening. Donald Trump stood at the heart of it all, watching as relief teams worked tirelessly to assist the struggling families, medical professionals attended to the sick, and volunteers distributed food and clothing. For the first time in years, these people were being seen. But Trump knew that real change couldn't end with one visit. A night of charity wouldn't erase years of suffering. This had to be more than just an act of generosity. It had to be the beginning of a movement. As the last of the local officials reluctantly began coordinating with Trump's team, reporters continued broadcasting the events in real time. Across the country, millions of Americans were watching. They had seen the moment Trump stopped his motorcade. They had seen Lily's trembling hands clutching that cardboard sign. And now, they saw what could happen when someone with real power decided to act instead of just talk. The next morning, headlines blazed across news outlets. Trump's unforgettable act of compassion sparks national movement. Lily's plea for help brings attention to America's forgotten families. A cardboard sign that changed the nation. Social media exploded with the hashtag #HopeForHeroes, a phrase that had been coined overnight as the story spread like wildfire. People from all walks of life were sharing their own stories. Veteran families struggling in silence, single parents barely making ends meet, homeless individuals who had once served their country only to be abandoned. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. She had become a symbol. And Trump wasn't about to let that momentum fade. Within hours of the first broadcasts, calls flooded government offices and charitable organizations. People wanted to help. Businesses pledged donations. Volunteers signed up in droves. A well-known billionaire anonymously donated millions to fund housing for struggling veteran families. Schools, churches, and community centers across the country mobilized to support those in need. Trump, back at the White House, held a special press conference. The energy in the room was palpable. Reporters, government officials, and even celebrities had gathered. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. He stood at the podium, a photograph of Lily and her mother displayed on the screen behind him. The world had seen their pain. Now, they would see a solution. "Last night," he began, his voice steady and unwavering, "I met a little girl with more courage than most politicians in Washington. A girl who should have been playing with dolls, going to school, and dreaming about her future. But instead, she was standing alone on a street corner, fighting to save her mother's life." He let the silence settle over the room before continuing. "This is not an isolated case. There are thousands of Lilys across this country, families of veterans who gave everything for America, yet have nothing left for themselves. That ends today." The room was still. Then, the announcement that would shake the nation. "Effective immediately, we are launching the Hope for Heroes initiative, a nationwide effort dedicated to supporting veteran families, eradicating homelessness among those who served, and ensuring that no American hero is ever left behind. The plan was extensive. Funds would be redirected to assist struggling veteran communities. Private companies would be incentivized to provide employment and housing solutions, and immediate relief efforts would be coordinated with local governments. Reporters shot up from their seats. "Mr. Trump, how soon will this take effect?" one asked. Trump's answer was immediate. "It already has." Over the next few weeks, America watched a transformation unfold before their eyes. What had begun as a single act of kindness had now become a national mission. Veteran homelessness saw a dramatic decline. Emergency medical aid reached families who had been suffering in silence. Communities that had been long ignored were finally given the resources they needed. And at the heart of it all was Lily. She and her mother had been given a new home, a fresh start, and the security they had once lost. But Lily's impact went far beyond that. She became the face of the movement, appearing alongside Trump at events, reminding America why they were fighting. She stood before massive crowds and spoke in her small but determined voice. "If I could ask for help for my mom, then maybe we can all ask for help for someone else." The applause that followed wasn't just for her. It was for every forgotten family that now had hope. Months later, a grand event was held in Washington, D.C., the official unveiling of the Hope for Heroes Monument, a towering tribute to the families of fallen and struggling veterans. On the base of the monument, an inscription read, "No hero is forgotten. No sacrifice is ignored. No child should beg for help. Today, we stand together." Trump, standing beside Lily, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they watched the monument unveiled. The girl who had once been invisible to the world now stood as a beacon of change. A journalist approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Trump," she asked, "did you ever expect that stopping for one little girl would change the entire country?" Trump smiled, glancing down at Lily, then back at the cameras. "Sometimes, all it takes is one voice. You just have to be willing to listen." As the sun set over Washington, America wasn't just watching a movement. They were part of it. And in that moment, history was made. This story is more than just a powerful moment. It's a lesson in compassion, leadership, and the impact of taking action. When Donald Trump stopped his motorcade for a single homeless girl, he didn't just change her life. He ignited a movement that brought hope to countless struggling families. It reminds us that true leadership isn't about power. It's about using that power to lift others up. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to overlook those in need. But as this story proves, one small act of kindness can spark real change. Imagine what could happen if more people chose to step up instead of looking away. If this story inspired you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video, because the more people who see it, the more hope we can spread. Together, we can make a difference.